But was she merely a victim of ill fate, or was she atoning for something far more sinister? Inbred Habsburgs, Maria Antonia of Austria first saw the light of day on January 18, 1669, within the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, the Austrian capital. Her father was Leopold I, a figure of immense power. He reigned as Holy Roman Emperor and King over Hungary, Croatia, and Bohemia. Her mother was Margaret Theresa of Spain, offspring of King Philip IV and Mariana of Austria. As you may or may not be aware, both of Maria Antonia's parents hailed from the formidable House of Habsburg, a dynasty that expanded its dominion across much of Europe not through military conquest alone, but through astute marital alliances and opportune circumstances. The Habsburg dynasty boasted royal branches in both Spain and Austria, and their families had been intermarrying since the early 16th century. However, as time progressed, their fixation on preserving power evolved into something considerably more perverse. They were not merely marrying distant kin, rather they took it to extremes. Second cousins, first cousins, even uncles and nieces. These centuries of unwavering inbreeding reached their culmination in Maria Antonia. She was not simply the result of a single ill-advised union. She was the product of successive generations of uncle-niece marriages, exacerbating the dynasty's genetic deterioration. Indeed, her own parents were uncle and niece. In a somewhat unsettling manner, her mother, Margaret Theresa, even addressed her husband as uncle affectionately. All of this meant Maria Antonia was the most intensely inbred Habsburg in history, surpassing even her notorious uncle, King Charles II of Spain. Her inbreeding coefficient was so elevated that she was genetically closer to the product of a parent-child or sibling union. So, what were the ramifications for Maria Antonia? Would she endure a destiny as tragic as Charles II, or had she somehow evaded the curse of her family's obsession? Early life. Remarkably, Maria Antonia was born in good health and developed into a relatively typical child, defying expectations given her extreme level of inbreeding. However, she was the exception, not the norm. As the second-born child of her parents' deeply incestuous marriage, she stood alone as the only one to survive past infancy, likely a consequence of the centuries of inbreeding that had weakened their lineage. Maria Antonia was left without a mother at just 4 years old, and as the sole surviving child of her parents' deeply inbred marriage, she was abruptly thrust into a precarious situation. She became a potential heir to the Archduchy of Austria, but only until her father remarried and produced a male successor. Austria had never been ruled by a woman, and it was uncertain whether the law even permitted it. Should Leopold die unexpectedly, would the aristocracy accept a female sovereign? Or would Austria descend into turmoil? And Maria Antonia's potential was not limited to Austria alone. She also possessed a strong claim to succeed to the Spanish throne, placing her at the heart of one of Europe's most powerful and unstable dynasties. King Charles II, Maria Antonia might have been the most inbred Habsburg of all time, but it was her uncle Carlos, known to history as Charles II of Spain, who bore the brunt of its consequences. From the moment of his birth, his physical form was failing him. He suffered from a horrifying range of health problems, intellectual disability, skeletal deformities that barely allowed him to walk, and a body that aged prematurely, resulting in early-onset dementia. But his most notorious feature? The grotesque Habsburg jaw, so severely deformed he could scarcely masticate his food. Charles ascended to the Spanish throne in 1665, just before his 4th birthday. However, he would never be capable of ruling independently and consistently relied on advisors and proxies who governed in his stead. Consequently, the subject of succession was a constant topic of discussion in European courts. With her mother's passing in March 1673, Maria Antonia became the rightful heir to her uncle, King Charles II of Spain. Although only 11 years old at the time, Charles's fragile health and profound disabilities led many to question his ability to father an heir. This positioned Maria Antonia as the presumptive future Queen of Spain, destined to inherit not only the Spanish crown, but its vast empire spanning Europe, the Americas, and beyond. And given Charles's declining condition, that day might arrive sooner than anticipated. Austrian propaganda. As a consequence of these circumstances, Maria Antonia lived her life under intense scrutiny. Diplomats meticulously observed her conduct during their visits to the Viennese court, and her father actively promoted the notion that she would one day succeed Charles. This resulted in a substantial amount of Habsburg propaganda. Maria Antonia posed for numerous portraits during her youth, a customary practice for royals. Her father employed these paintings to bolster her claim to the Spanish throne, disseminating them across Europe and to Spain to enhance her public image and solidify her status. This was deemed essential due to her gender. Had a male heir to the Spanish throne resided in Vienna, such extensive propaganda efforts would have been unnecessary. However, apprehension regarding female rule was deeply ingrained, and the prospect of a woman inheriting Spain's immense empire was enough to cause consternation throughout the courts of Europe. Family life. As Maria Antonia matured in Vienna, she remained largely unaware of the political tempest swirling around her. While the major European powers debated her future, she was raised in the manner befitting a high-born Habsburg princess, enveloped in courtly protocol and attended to by servants who fulfilled her every desire. Her education was typical for a royal woman of her era: Latin, French, music, and foundational elements of the humanist curriculum. Observers described her as reserved and serious, yet possessing intelligence and distinction. However, following her mother's death, life became even more formal. Nonetheless, Maria Antonia experienced a rapid succession of stepmothers. Within months of his wife's passing, Leopold married his second cousin, Archduchess Claudia Felicitas of Austria, a member of the Tyrolean Habsburg branch. Maria Antonia developed a positive and close bond with his stepmother, but she too succumbed to an early death in 1676 due to tuberculosis. Leopold then took a third wife, a German noblewoman, and also his second cousin, Eleanor Magdalene of Neuburg. She and Leopold would have 10 children together, resulting in Maria Antonia gaining a new half-sibling almost annually. When a son named Joseph was born from this third marriage in 1678, it signified the arrival of a male heir to Leopold's titles. Now, Maria Antonia was solely the heir to the Spanish throne, although, as we have seen, the question of her succession to Charles in Madrid remained uncertain. Of course, another possibility existed. Maria Antonia could produce a son herself, a Habsburg prince who would be the ideal male heir to claim the Spanish throne. Her father, ever the strategist, was already contemplating this future while she was still a child, recognizing that a male successor could secure Spain for their bloodline once and for all. Her marriage to secure the Spanish throne, Leopold made a startling proposition. He intended to marry his 6-year-old daughter Maria Antonia to her own uncle, the 13-year-old King Charles II of Spain. Even within a family renowned for inbreeding, this match was astonishing, not merely due to the uncle-niece relationship, but also because neither party was ready for matrimony. Charles had not even reached puberty, and Maria was far too young to bear children. Despite these factors, their engagement was formally announced in 1676, and a proxy wedding was planned for December. However, at the 11th hour, the arrangement dissolved. The following year, Charles informed Leopold that he could not proceed. Spain required an heir, and his niece was simply too young. In both Munich and Brussels, Maria Antonia endured profound unhappiness. On the surface, the marriage was not entirely disadvantageous. Maximilian was only a few years her senior, and their kinship was distant enough to somewhat mitigate the Habsburg inbreeding. However, other issues arose. He was a gregarious extrovert, while she was a scholarly introvert who disliked courtly formalities. Maximilian often treated her with disrespect, and a contemporary even described him as possessing one of the most perverse minds and hearts imaginable. Maximilian wasted no time in betraying his young wife, openly flaunting his mistress while Maria Antonia suffered through the cold, loveless marriage into which she had been compelled. Yet her greatest suffering stemmed not from her unfaithful husband, but from her own ill-fated bloodline. Like many of her tragically inbred forebears, she struggled with pregnancy, losing 2 sons at birth in 1689 and 1690. By 1691, Maria Antonia had reached her limit. Pregnant once more and unwilling to endure Maximilian's humiliations, she fled to Vienna, leaving behind her unfaithful spouse. Rumors circulated that she had no intention of returning to him. Then in October 1692, against all odds, she gave birth to a healthy son, Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria, the child who held the potential to alter the course of European history. But Maria Antonia's struggle for survival was far from over. Death. The Spanish court erupted in jubilation at the birth of Joseph Ferdinand, the long-awaited heir. However, this moment of triumph came at a devastating cost. His mother's life. Maria Antonia contracted a postpartum infection, a condition readily treatable today with antibiotics. But in the 17th century, no such remedy existed. The body either overcame the infection or succumbed to it. As weeks passed, her fever intensified and her strength waned. By December, it became clear she was losing her fight. Then on Christmas Eve 1692, at just 23 years old, Maria Antonia breathed her last, leaving behind her infant son, Joseph Ferdinand, the fragile hope for Spain's future. But with the succession still unresolved, Europe's great powers were already watching and waiting. The clash for the Spanish throne, Maria Antonia's death dramatically reopened the question of Spanish succession. It was evident by this point that her uncle, Charles, was incapable of producing children, and his health was dire. Contemporaries anticipated his demise annually throughout the 1690s, though he ultimately persevered until late 1700. In the years following Maria Antonia's death, the Austrian Habsburgs fiercely contested to solidify their claim to the Spanish throne and its vast empire. Their rationale? Maria Antonia's son, young Joseph Ferdinand, was the rightful heir. After all, he was not just any claimant. He was the great-grandson of King Philip IV, who had reigned over Spain from 1621 to 1665, making his lineage one of the strongest links to the waning Spanish dynasty. Most observers at the Spanish court concurred that Maria's son was the most qualified candidate to succeed Charles upon his death. However, the French royal house of Bourbon also possessed a claim. Philip IV's daughter, Maria Theresa, had married Louis XIV, King of France, in 1660, a union that yielded numerous children and grandchildren. One of these grandchildren was a boy named Philip, the great-grandson of King Philip III of Spain, who had ruled at the dawn of the 17th century. He might have been entirely overlooked, if not for tragedy. In 1699, Maria Antonia's sole surviving son, Joseph Ferdinand, succumbed to smallpox, the era's deadliest disease. With his passing, the Austrian Habsburgs' claim to the Spanish throne faltered, forcing them to redirect their ambitions towards one of Leopold's younger sons, Charles, who would soon emerge as the new contender for Spain's vast empire. When King Charles II ultimately died childless on November 1, 1700, the Spanish Habsburg dynasty reached its end. On his deathbed, Charles made a momentous decision. He designated the French candidate Philip as his heir, ensuring Spain's alignment with France. But this ignited outrage across Europe. The Austrians, supported by England and the Dutch, refused to accept this outcome, and within months the continent was embroiled in war. Thus, in 1701, the brutal War of the Spanish Succession commenced, a 13-year conflict that involved nearly every major European power. In the end, the French candidate prevailed, and Philip V ascended to the Spanish throne. But with a condition: Spain and France were forbidden from uniting under a single crown. Meanwhile, the Austrians were compensated with Spain's extensive European territories, encompassing Belgium, Milan, Naples, and Sardinia. Had Maria Antonia or her son lived, the succession crisis might have been far less chaotic, and history profoundly different. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching this video on Maria Antonia, the most inbred Habsburg. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of her life down below in the comments, and if you have any suggestions, also let me know down below in the comments. Anyway, I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them.